I'm Lisa Wolf-Chason, and this is my COM550 research project, which I'm calling Making Sense of the Senseless. I examined the communication following two school shootings, the first of which was Sandy Hook Elementary in Newtown, Connecticut in 2012, the second being Marjory Stoneman Douglas High School, which occurred in Parkland, Florida in 2018. For brevity's sake, I'll be referring to that shooting as the Parkland shooting. My literature review focused on recapping the foundations of crisis communication, then looking at how social media changed that discipline, looking at how an organization's pre-crisis reputation hindered or helped their ability to achieve recovery, and then also utilizing a discourse of renewal. I used a qualitative case study method which reviewed two state commission reports. After both shootings, the then governors of the states at the time ordered a commission be formed of mental health, school, and school safety experts to review the situation and make recommendations. I reviewed both of those reports as well as around 20 news articles for each school shooting. The news articles appeared in local, regional, and national and international sources, and all were either published or aired within 3 months of the shooting. Once I had my data, I used open and axial coding and then used grounded theory to further analyze emergent themes, of which there were 8 total. The first theme was the motives and actions of the shooter. In Sandy Hook Advisory Commission, they really focused on Adam Lanza's actions, but as a way to talk about his social isolation and make recommendations moving forward for other people who may be facing a mental health crisis. In the Marjory Stoneman Douglas High School Advisory, they really focused on the actions of Nicholas Cruz to highlight some missteps of law enforcement, school, and social support agencies. This is a theme we'll discuss later. The news coverage for both shootings was very similar in that they wanted to know a lot about the gunman's backstory as well as look for a possible motive. The second theme was access to weapon. In Sandy Hook's case, the Advisory Commission really just mentioned weapons as a means of how Adam Lanza acquired them, which was through his mother's legal purchase of them. He lived with his mother at the time of the shooting. In the Marjory Stoneman Douglas High School Commission, they really focused heavily on weapons, guns, and violence, and the news coverage again was very similar in that they really spoke about the access of the weapons to the gunmen, and that set up some of the advocacy themes that again I'll discuss later in this presentation. The third theme was a focus on school safety before and after the crisis, as well as the response of law enforcement. Sandy Hook's Advisory Commission really praised the actions of not only school staff, but law enforcement officials, and really just recommended things on top of the good foundation that they said that the school system had in place. So they weren't criticizing the school system. They said they had a good level of safety in place, and they just wanted to add on to it to help future schools. Whereas Marjory Stoneman Douglas High School criticized the school safety system as well as heavily criticized the actions of law enforcement. In fact, this was a theme throughout a majority of their commission report. As a result, the news coverage did differ. Sandy Hook praised the staff and law enforcement as heroes, whereas in Parkland, the law enforcement response as well as the school response was criticized, and some individuals involved were even called cowards on a national scale. The fourth theme is the theme in which the two shootings really start to differentiate themselves, and that's warning signs, blames, and failures. Sandy Hook really consolidated their blame to the gunman, Adam Lanza. And that was really, they didn't look to establish blame for any other party. Marjory Stoneman Douglas High School's Safety Commission really focused heavily on looking for missteps, warning signs from Nicholas Cruz himself that he posted on social media, and blame of law enforcement in their response to the shooting. As a result, the news coverage of Parkland's shooting also heavily criticized a lot of the different structural systems in place and questioned the actions of them, and media coverage of Sandy Hook really focused the blame to the gunman, Adam Lanza. Now, this also could be because Lanza took his life at the end of the shooting, whereas Nicholas Cruz is still living, so they were looking possibly for more answers in that shooting in Parkland. The fifth theme is impact on victims, families, and survivors. Both of the commission reports began with a dedicated section to the victims. Sandy Hook then took it a step further and dedicated an entire section to their commission report on how to involve families and in recovery and resiliency effort. And they did not have parents take part in the committee. However, they interviewed several parents as part of their findings. The Parkland Commission There were 2 parents who participated on the panel. However, they didn't really interview other parents, and they didn't dedicate a section to involving families and the community in the recovery process. The news coverage of Sandy Hook put more of an emphasis on victims over the gunmen when you added up the totals of the mentions, whereas in Parkland, there was far more mention on the gunmen than the victims. The 6th theme is connecting people with who experience trauma or tragedy with mental support. Sandy Hook spent a third of their commission report on this topic and really wanted to combat social isolation, grief, and the stigma around mental health. Marjorie Stoneman Douglas High School's commission really just focused on Nicholas Cruz's mental health and didn't really spend any time connecting mental health resources to the community at large who might need them. The news coverage was similar. In these 2 tragedies, they really focused on the trauma and tragedy of the event and didn't really talk about mental health unless it was to speculate on whether or not mental health played an action in the role of the shooter. The 7th theme was advocacy and protest. This is another big area where we see differences between the 2 commissions and the 2 school communities. Sandy Hook's commission, they were united in their effort. They all agreed that they really wanted to tackle mental health stigma. They wanted to look at gun control as well as improve school safety. Marjorie Stoneman High School's commission, something interesting happened. You had student survivors who became very prominent voices in advocating for gun reform. And then you had lawmakers, adults, and the commission members who wanted more guns in schools through arming teachers. They thought this was a way to improve school safety. So the news coverage of Sandy Hook really showcased a community coming together, and in Parkland, it really showed a divide. So it focused heavily on the student protesters as well as the actions of the commission who were making recommendations to the legislature for possible changes in law. And these 2 efforts were really at odds with one another, so they became divided and fractured. This really impacted the 8th theme, which was healing, recovery, and renewal. Sandy Hook really successfully achieved recovery and renewal. The commission spent significant time talking about resiliency, recovery, empathy, and donations for survivors in the school community, where Marjorie Stoneman Douglas really didn't focus on recovery. They were still focused on looking into past mistakes, but they did attempt to memorialize the victims, as did the Sandy Hook Commission. News coverage of Sandy Hook really talked about how the community again was brought together. They even talked about how the event inspired acts of kindness throughout the globe, and they focused on how the students returned to a different campus to kind of return that sense of normalcy and start their lives again. Parkland, unfortunately, the students had to return to the scene of the crime. So though they weren't going into the building where the shooting took place, they were returning to their same school campus, and that became more of the focus of the news media, and it might have been more difficult for the community to achieve recovery when they were reminded of the shooting every day when they returned. Both schools did return about 2 or 3 weeks after the shooting occurred, so that was similar. My findings overall was that in Sandy Hook's instance, the stakeholders were very united and very involved almost from the get-go in the healing and recovery process. The commission as well as the school community made sure to involve parents, surviving students, just community members, anyone who really wanted to take part, they invited. They also took a forward-looking and proactive approach, and ultimately they achieved recovery and renewal. In Parkland's case, the stakeholders were divided and had different ideas of how they should move forward, and the commission report looked to the past to make sense of the tragedy instead of adapting that forward-looking approach. The community to this day continues to heal and recover. So the defense questions, the first one was why I selected these 2 events for the study. And I selected these 2 because though one was a high school and one was an elementary school, recently they're the 2 most prominent school shootings that we've seen as a nation. So they occurred 6 years apart, but they really were the most prominently covered in the media school shootings that we've had in recent times. I do think I'd have different responses if I focused on 2 high schools who experienced school shootings or 2 elementary schools, and I also think I'd see some differences if they were closer in time because social media trends evolve so quickly, and as I mentioned, a big part of Parkland's focus was looking at some of the warning signs that the gunman Nicholas Cruz exhibited online and why those were missed. Additionally, in Parkland, you had students tweeting and sharing videos in real time of what they were experiencing as the shooting unfolded, and that undoubtedly had an impact on public perception as well as the media coverage. So in elementary school, students don't have the same access to phones, and again, you had a 6-year gap, so phones and social media can greatly evolve in that time. I think some of the approach with the stakeholders were due to the student's age, and I think that does change the organizational communication. I think Sandy Hook was very cognizant of the fact that they had highly engaged stakeholders and their parents who were very emotional because their students who were the victims were extremely vulnerable because of their age. They capitalized on that by showing a lot of empathy, being very gentle in their response, and making sure that the parents involved really could be involved if they wanted. Parkland also did communicate well in the immediate aftermath of the shooting. It was more of their long-term recovery efforts where they failed to involve their stakeholders, and it might have been because the students at Parkland were older, so they were deemed more self-sufficient. So it could have been that the parents may have been seen as more self-sufficient in healing in their own grief. I would probably do differently if I had more time to work on this project. I would love to have interviewed the members of the crisis management teams of both school organizations. Given that this research was conducted during a pandemic and members of a crisis communication team are typically busy during those type of times, it was just not possible to secure those interviews. I wanted to do semi-structured interviews with members of both teams to see how really they communicated with their school communities immediately following, and instead I had to rely on the commission reports for that. And the last question is, what would a qualitative person-focused study look like, and what would a more in-depth qualitative study emerge if this wasn't a case study? And again, I would have loved to do semi-structured interviews, not only with the crisis management team, but I also think it would be interesting to do semi-structured interviews with some of the parents of students who attended both of these schools at the time of the shooting. Ideally, it'd be great to get parents of victims, but any parent who received the communication from the school would probably offer very valuable insights instead of making assumptions based on what was seen in the news coverage and in those commission reports. I want to thank you for all of your guidance and help in completing this project, and I look forward to your review and response.